Before the nuclear bomb, no weapon evoked so much passion and fear as the battleship.
The battleship was, in its day, the biggest and most complicated moving artifact in existence.
The battleship story is controversial. One of the largest and most expensive weapons ever built, it played a dramatic role in shaping the modern world. In the first global arms race, emperors, politicians and admirals all became intoxicated by the majesty and firepower of the floating fortress.
They were considered to be a tool of world policy. It demonstrated the country's ability to act on a world stage.
The Battleships is an epic saga of the quest for global supremacy that culminated in the titanic sea battles of the 20th century.
History will look at the battleship and say, here was the most fiendish weapon that man could devise at the time.
For as long as men have gone to sea, maritime nations have sought wealth and power beyond their borders. By the 18th century, Spain, France, Holland, Portugal and Britain had established vast colonial empires. And it was their grand sailing vessels of oak and canvas that became both vehicles for trade and the spearhead of security between colonies and home. In the era of sail, imperial jealousies were played out in dramatic confrontations at sea. The man of war, mounting row after row of deadly cannon, was the most devastating weapon of the age.
The British method of fighting in those days, whether you were a three-deck ship, a frigate or a line of battleship of 74 guns, was to close with the enemy as soon as possible and then bring all your guns to bear on his hull and pour your broadsides into his hull. You cannot actually sink very well a wooden ship. But what you can do by pounding the hull of the enemy is to destroy the morale of the people on board. And it's the destruction of their morale that will bring about their defeat.
In political terms, he who ruled the oceans ruled the world. And for almost 2 centuries, that nation was Britain. The first permanent navy, and arguably the first battleships, were the creation of the ambitious English king, Henry VIII. His fighting ships, like the Mary Rose, were revolutionary vessels designed solely for war. Until that time, battles at sea were fought between merchant ships armed with guns.
Well, I think it's fair to say that the Mary Rose is the first extant ship that was designed specifically for warfare on a large scale. So you can say she is an embryonic battleship, if you like. Well, whether the Mary Rose was built around guns or guns were built for the Mary Rose is actually a very, very difficult thing to analyze. Undoubtedly, the ship was designed for heavy guns, and without a doubt, this is the first series of ships that are designed specifically to take large guns on 3 decks.
Her armaments were a mixture of muzzle or front-loading cannon and early breech or rear-loading guns. A fairly unreliable weapon, but one that was to become the main armament of future battleships. Mary Rose and her sister ships were the foundation of a maritime dynasty that would influence world affairs for well over 3 centuries. Superweapons that became symbols of state for any self-respecting empire builder.
I think all the vessels within Henry VIII's infant navy, if you like, were symbols of both the king's power and also the might of Britain as a naval force.
In the following 200 years, confrontations between rival empires saw the fighting ship evolve into the magnificent ship of the line. HMS Victory, with her 3 gun decks, was a typical first-rate line of battleship. A vessel capable of keeping the sea in any season, in any part of the world. Launched in 1765, she carried 27 miles of rigging, set 4 acres of canvas, and took 6 years to build. A forest of more than 2,000 oak trees was felled for her construction. Victory was over twice the length and 7 times the tonnage of Mary Rose, and represented a dynasty of sailing ships that had become truly perfected as weapons in themselves.
The Victory, like all the other great sailing battleships of the period, like all battleships indeed, is a floating gun platform. Just look at that massive battery of guns that you see as you stand alongside her. 50 guns, all pointing towards you. 32-pounders, 24-pounders, 12-pounders, all designed to deliver a shattering blow, a blow that could destroy a building within a few minutes with the power of it.
She had a very heavy fire output. It's something like about half a ton of metal fired out on one broadside. She would have a very large crew, 820 to 850 men. And it must have been horrendous working in those conditions because the decks are relatively low. There is not much escape for smoke, not much escape from the damage that you receive either.
In the defence of empire, Victory's grand arsenal was to become Britain's front line in the most dramatic sea battle ever fought under sail. In 1803, Victory became the flagship of Admiral Horatio Nelson. It was a time when the British feared invasion of their country from across the English Channel by Napoleon's troops. The French leader boasted, "Let us be masters of the Straits for 6 hours, and we shall be masters of the world." On October 9, 1805, Nelson invited his captains to dine with him on board Victory. He told them of his dramatic plan to end, once and for all, the so-called Great Terror posed by the combined French and Spanish fleets. He argued that the traditional manner of approaching the enemy in single file and engaging them at close range was outdated. Instead, they would sail in two columns, heading for the enemy line to break it up and cause a general melee. The tactic was a gamble.
At Trafalgar, the two fleets were in contact from dawn on the 21st. They were approaching a collision at approximately 2 knots. So the men on both sides had ample time to breakfast and lunch and change their clothes and think about what was about to happen.
At the Battle of Trafalgar, Nelson's ships were by no means the largest or most heavily armed. But in the era of fighting sail, the means of waging war afloat was an art, not a science. It was commanders like Nelson who won battles, not ships.
The interesting thing about Nelson's tactics at Trafalgar is that he put himself into a position which normally you would have tried to avoid. And the reason he did that was because he realized that the French and Spanish fundamentally couldn't shoot straight.
Nelson's fleet of 27 men of war overcame the combined 33 ships of France and Spain in a matter of hours, clinching a decisive victory for Britain.
But I think it was the crushing nature of the victory. It showed that the Royal Navy even could defeat a superior fleet in terms of numbers, that in fact the Royal Navy could annihilate any equal. And it therefore sort of consecrated the image of the Royal Navy as the dominant fleet.
Excitement in Britain at the news of the victory was tempered by mourning. A shot to the chest added Nelson to the list of 5,000 who perished on both sides. Such was the human cost of a battle that secured Britain's sovereignty of the oceans for at least another 100 years. The next challenge to the Royal Navy's superiority came not in war, but from new technology. 19th century Britain was being transformed by the Industrial Revolution. Portsmouth, home to the Royal Naval Dockyards in the southeast, was set to become the largest industrial centre in the world. In its factories and shipyards, the sounds of the hammer and the adze were giving way to the throb of the steam engine, revolutionising labour-intensive work, such as the cutting of timber and the manufacture of pulleys for rigging. By the 1830s, steam was powering merchant ships across the Atlantic, offering the promise of greater speed and mastery over unpredictable winds and currents. The British Navy explored the benefits of converting its warships to the new technology. But the Admiralty concluded steam would render its entire sailing fleet obsolete. When news reached London that the French Navy was already experimenting with steam, the British Admiralty had no alternative but to meet the challenge. In the 1830s, steam-driven paddle wheels were fitted to existing battleships. But the experiment proved a failure. Paddle wheels were found to be vulnerable to enemy fire and required too much deck space, reducing the quantity of a ship's cannon.
The paddle was fundamentally incompatible with the line of battleship. So the Admiralty produced specialist paddle vessels, paddle sloops and paddle frigates. And one of the important roles of these paddle steamers was to tow the ships of the line. By the 1840s, the battle fleet was a mix of ships of the line and each of them having a paddle steamer.
The perfect alternative to the paddle wheel first appeared in a visionary transatlantic liner of the mid-1840s, the Great Britain. Naval architects quickly recognized that the screw propeller was more efficient than the paddle wheel, and if fitted to battleships, would prove less vulnerable to enemy fire.
So it wasn't until the invention of the propeller, the underwater screw, and its application to warships that steam power really became a goer as far as naval forces were concerned.
The Great Britain featured another striking innovation, an iron hull. But the Royal Navy met suggestions that battleships should be built of iron with scepticism. With its time-honoured policy of preserving the established order, the Admiralty saw no reason to discard the wooden walls that had protected the Empire for centuries. Unless, of course, it was forced to do so. In May 1858, disturbing intelligence crossed the English Channel. The brilliant French director of naval construction, Dupuy de Lome, had ordered a new radical type of battleship, which he promised could survive any confrontation. Plated with 4 inches of iron over her 11-inch teak hull, Gloire could lay claim to being the first iron battleship. And there were more on the drawing board. The British Parliament and press were alarmed at the development. The country was seized by panic.
Les Anglais ont été mortifiés de voir que ils avaient manqué finalement le cuirassé. Même le mari de la reine Victoria s'est exprimé durement devant le Parlement, estimant que l'Angleterre devait quand même conserver la maîtrise de la mer par la technologie.
After months of tortured debate, British Admiralty decided again to meet the French challenge by building an even more radical vessel. A vessel designed to be the most deadly warship in existence. In 1860, Britain answered the Gloire with her own iron warship, HMS Warrior. Lord of the Admiralty Sir John Packington described her as the most courageous enterprise ever undertaken by the Royal Navy outside of war. She was 100 feet longer than any warship ever built, and the most heavily armed. Her 26 68-pounders were 5 times more powerful than the cannons carried by Nelson's Victory. She also mounted 10 breech loaders, which fired explosive shells, revolutionary weapons that had recently proved devastating to timber battleships in the Crimean War. The rear loading barrels were rifled, which greatly improved accuracy, spinning the projectile and giving it an unprecedented range of up to 2.5 miles. Warrior's gun deck and her massive steam engine were enclosed in an iron citadel, 4 inches thick. making her impervious to any weapon of the day. And with a maximum speed of more than 14 knots, she could outrun any warship on the high seas.
She was so much stronger, so much faster, bigger, better in every way. Warrior would have dominated the Gloire.
The Gloire, if you like, stimulated the British into making this great change, but the change they responded with was quite beyond anything that the Gloire represented.
Gloire was a terrible error on the part of the French. We've been fighting a building race with the French on wooden steam warships, and the French had kept pace with our building. By changing into the new technology of iron and armour, French industry just couldn't cope, and they'd lost.
The age of the wooden battleship was all but over. Warrior and Gloire had rendered every warship on Earth obsolete. But soon, they themselves would be outdated. A new race was beginning. A race between armour and firepower. When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, the ill-prepared Union and Confederate navies hurriedly began building ironclad warships. The Confederates' Virginia, a captured enemy frigate, was encased in railroad iron. Using its bow as a ram, it sank 2 Union frigates with ease, revealing the vulnerability of timber warships in the Age of Iron. The Union Navy countered with Monitor, a remarkable semi-submerged ironclad, designed by the Swede John Ericsson. In the first ever battle between iron ships, Monitor's new type of revolving turret gun proved faster firing than her opponent's fixed gun. More importantly, her crew only had to turn the gun, rather than the ship, to take aim.
The Monitor was the first warship in the world ever to have a turreted gun, and she was also obviously the first to use it in combat. And it was quite successful. What the turret meant was that a smaller, less expensive ship could deal with a larger ship whose guns couldn't be maneuvered. So it's a very different kind of technology and quite superior.
The turret gun was a powerful innovation. In a matter of decades, it would adorn every new battleship and spell an end to the fixed gun. In the 1870s, the battleship began to lose all vestiges of sail. The funnel, like the chimney stack on land, had become the outward symbol of progress. Navies also began adopting cutting-edge technologies for their battleships. Demands for greater protection saw steel take over from iron for armor plate. But even this breakthrough would soon be matched by an increase in firepower.
Once you open the Pandora's box of technological change, you can't shut it. It leapfrogs in a quite extraordinary way. One invention will lead to another. You invent a gun that will pierce armor. You then have to invent armor that will stop the gun piercing it. And so the development of battleship design was a never-ending leapfrog.
In the vast shipyards of France and Britain, a great battleship arms race was gaining momentum. But with every new generation of larger, deadlier battleships, the world became a more dangerous place. By the late 19th century, smaller navies around the globe also aspired to possess a fleet of the largest and most deadly machines ever conceived.
Culturally, Battleship becomes an icon of modernism, of technology, of progress. And for many nations that were not previously naval, the battleship of the 1890s and the 1900s becomes their introduction to the sea as a whole new way of thinking about their country. My country built this ship and put a name on it which tells us a great deal about how we see ourselves in the world, not at home, but in the world. A country with a battle fleet is more than a country, it's an empire.
In the early 1880s, a mere 20 years after the Civil War, the United States Navy was neglected and facing oblivion. President Grover Cleveland told his countrymen they had not a single vessel of war that could keep the seas against a first-class enemy.
In the 1880s, the United States is a very wealthy country. Large cities like New York, Boston, are essentially defenseless. And those in the Navy who are trying to make an argument that there should be a powerful U.S. Navy talk about European powers as possible enemies. There's still a very strong sentiment of anti-British attitude. Remember that we fought the British in 1812. Also, we worried about the fact that some of the South Americans were more powerful than we were. Brazil had bought some new battleships, and we had nothing to match. There was a sense that the United States was a rich prize waiting to fall into someone's hands.
Despite the president's fears of invasion, the Congress was against building battleships, favoring the preservation of the nation's fiercely isolationist stance. A U.S. naval captain, Alfred Mahan, would dramatically change this mindset. In his classic book of 1890, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, Mahan traced the rise and fall of maritime powers. He demonstrated that the nation which controlled the seas controlled its own fate, and those lacking in naval mastery were doomed.
Specifically in his book, he argued that if one had a choice between developing sea power and land power, that a country was well advised to develop sea power because the return on investment was higher. And Mahan believed that any number of countries had this potential. It wasn't just a case of Great Britain, but also France, possibly Germany, but especially his own country, the United States.
Mahan made a dramatic suggestion. The United States should build an offensive rather than defensive navy, comprising an enormous fleet of battleships.
If the United States is to prevent Europeans from burning down American cities, which was the fear that we had at that time, it has to be able to put its fleet where they are. We defend the United States elsewhere, not in the United States.
Mahan's forceful ideas helped persuade Congress to build an ocean-going fleet. In less than 2 decades, the United States would boast the second largest navy in the world, comprising 17 battleships and 24 cruisers. Ships like the 6,000-ton cruiser USS Olympia, commissioned in 1893, were a coming of age for the US Navy, and for the country's stature as an industrialized nation. By government decree, every aspect of the ships, from their rivets to their armor and heavy turreted guns, were to be manufactured at home, pushing the nation's industrial capabilities to new limits. The decision to build an ocean-going battle fleet marked a radical shift in how the United States saw its position in the world and how it was prepared to act. In late 1897, Washington received reports of a rebellion in the Spanish colony of Cuba over demands for independence. In December, the president dispatched the battleship Maine on a so-called friendly visit to Havana. Its mission to ensure the well-being of US citizens living there and assert the nation's emergence as a naval force. Two months later, the Maine was destroyed in Havana Harbor by two massive explosions. "252 men were killed in the disaster. For the first time, the tragic consequences of the loss of a battleship were captured on the new medium of the motion picture. For the American public, potent images of their nation's first blooding in the dangerous game of gunboat diplomacy. The reason for the catastrophe was later traced to an explosion in the battleship's internal magazines. But at the time, the US Navy concluded a Spanish mine most likely sank the ship. American popular opinion turned strongly in favor of retribution against Spain. In a matter of months, America would go to war by sea for the first time in its history. In late April 1898, Secretary for the Navy Theodore Roosevelt dispatched US warships to Cuba and other parts of the Spanish Empire. Commodore George Dewey commanded the Asiatic Squadron. Aboard his flagship Olympia, he set sail for the Spanish colony of the Philippines. At dawn on the 1st of May, Dewey's crew sighted a small squadron of Spanish gunboats anchored in Manila Bay. In less than 6 hours, the Spanish ships were annihilated. News of the United States Navy's first victory at sea was greeted with national approval and thrust future President Theodore Roosevelt into the national spotlight. Over the next 3 months, the US Navy backed up the nation's troops as they captured the Spanish colonies of the Philippines, Guam, and islands of the Caribbean. With its modest fleet of battleships and cruisers, America entered a select club of empire builders and emerged as a new world power. The arrival of the US Navy on the world's oceans would, in time, cause concern for Britain. But as the century turned, the small island nation seemed impervious to any hostile power. Her wealth and independence came from the largest empire in history. 1/4 of the world's land and people were ruled by Queen Victoria and jealously guarded by her all-powerful fleet. But for most of the previous century, Europe had been a boiling cauldron of militarism. Border after border was drawn and redrawn in blood. As Europe's old nations crumbled, new ambitious empire builders emerged. And to consolidate their colonial ambitions, kings and emperors looked to the battleship. As the navies of Europe expanded, Britain guaranteed funding to the Royal Navy to maintain a battle fleet greater than the next two most powerful navies combined. Whether the country could sustain the enormous costs involved, however, was in serious doubt. By 1900, British industry and the economy was suffering a downturn. To make matters worse, a new industrial nation was emerging. A nation that dreamt of building battleships to challenge Britain's control of the seas. That burgeoning powerhouse of industry was the new United German Republic, ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II.
It was only natural for a nation like Germany to wish to be a global power. She was a rising industrial state. There was nothing which said that Britain had a natural right to be the unrivaled world power. If you wanted to expand economically and strategically, then you had to go to sea.
4 decades earlier, in January 1859, a 101-gun salute heralded Wilhelm's birth. The news was greeted with enthusiasm in Britain, especially by Queen Victoria. Wilhelm was the Queen's first grandchild, born to her daughter Princess Victoria and future German Emperor Prince Frederick. From an early age, Wilhelm's obsession was with the sea and ships. As a boy, he holidayed with his English cousins and visited the giant shipbuilding and naval center at Portsmouth.
Wilhelm's visits to the United Kingdom always placed before him the primacy of the Royal Navy in British society, politics, and economy, the importance of the fleet when it came to Britain's premier role in the world at the time. This was drilled into the Kaiser from first-hand experience, from his earliest personal experiences as a child.
On the one hand, Queen Victoria was his grandmother, and in many ways, he seems to have loved her. And he was always very proud of wearing the uniform of a British Admiral of the Fleet. And he admired the British and their achievements in building up the greatest navy of the world at that time. On the other hand, he also thought that it would be necessary for Germany to follow the British example, to build ships to conquer the world.
The great Prussian tradition that Germany had inherited, however, was not seamanship, but soldiery. With the most powerful army in the world, the German parliament, the Reichstag, saw no purpose in building a battle fleet. But a maverick naval captain serving in the High Command, Alfred Tirpitz, shared the Kaiser's dream.
What brings Tirpitz to the Kaiser's attention is a memo that Tirpitz writes. It suggests something that has since become called the risk theory. In essence, it's this, that the Germans can indeed provide a major threat to the British Grand Fleet, the British Royal Navy. How is this possible? Short of massive numbers, short of prohibitive investment. Well, it's possible in this way. You can provide the Royal Navy with a major threat in its own backyard. And furthermore, you don't have to equal them in numbers or firepower. What you need to do is provide a sufficient risk so that if the British did engage you, the price would be so enormous for them to pay, both in preparation and in losses in battle, that they would be reluctant to take that step of direct engagement in a decisive battle, because it might cost them their sea supremacy. And of course, Tirpitz himself provides the Kaiser with the rationale and the selling power to say we should build a fleet, we can build a fleet, we can make the British think twice before checking our economic progress or our military progress.
The Kaiser was so taken by the daring strategy, he promoted Tirpitz to Secretary for Naval Affairs. With the obstacle of a conservative German parliament to overcome, Tirpitz went direct to the German people for support. A select group of teachers and university professors travelled the country to lecture about Germany's new frontier, the sea. In the Kaiser's words, millions of stubborn and bad-tempered Germans suddenly awoke to the benefits of a powerful battle fleet.
It's difficult sometimes to persuade a farmer in the middle of Bavaria that a battleship really means something to his future or his present. And the Navy succeeded admirably in doing just that.
Finally, public pressure helped persuade the members of the Reichstag to fund Tirpitz's massive battleship program. By 1907, Germany would surpass the United States as the second largest navy in the world.
There are discussions among historians whether the Germans really aimed at a hot war ending in a great battle like that described by Mahan, or whether the Germans only wanted to blackmail the British by putting a dagger at their throat, thus enforcing them to give the Germans, as they regarded it, their equal share of world power.
The sheer ham-fistedness of the German approach. They are involving themselves in blackmail. They're creating themselves enemies. There is a very splendid German historian who has said, look, this behavior was ham-fisted, it was clumsy, but it's a way that an aspiring a power that's going up to being the most powerful power in Europe has always behaved.
Germany's naval challenge was met with foreboding in Britain. The government was forced to increase the naval budget yet again to keep ahead in battleship numbers. But for the Royal Navy, there was more at stake than sheer numbers could remedy. Inspired leadership was needed to match the brilliance of Admiral Tirpitz. That leadership was to be found in Admiral Jackie Fisher.
An extraordinary man, strange man, a genius, I think a little bit mad, like most geniuses are, but a man willing to come up with radical solutions for radical times.
When Fisher came to the Admiralty as First Sea Lord in 1904, he vowed to meet the German challenge. In a raft of sweeping and often controversial reforms, he ordered the scrapping of 100 outmoded warships and the return to home waters for scores of vessels on service around the globe. But his most important move was to establish a think tank of naval experts to assess the future of the battleship. Rapid advances in new weapons of war, the submarine, torpedo and mine, led some experts to argue the battleship's days were numbered. Fisher believed that fast armored cruisers would be the key to success in future wars. His so-called battle cruiser, while similar to the battleship in firepower, would need to sacrifice precious armor to gain speed, making it more vulnerable to torpedoes and mines. But a battle soon to be played out in the Far East would help settle any question of the battleship's future. In the second half of the 19th century, feudal Japan emerged from 200 years of self-imposed isolation. To defend her interests from foreign aggressors, samurai warriors traded their clans for armies and their swords for ships of war. By the turn of the century, the Imperial Japanese Navy boasted a fleet of 6 British-built battleships. Flagship of the fleet, the Mikasa, was typical of battleship design at the time. She was armed with 4 massive 12-inch turreted guns and a huge battery of smaller ordnance. Under the command of Admiral Hayakiro Togo, the Japanese fleet was a highly trained, tightly knit unit prepared for battle. When Japan became embroiled in a bloody war with Russia, she would prove herself a naval colossus in the making. In September 1904, the Russian Baltic fleet of 45 warships set out on a marathon voyage almost halfway around the world. Its purpose, retaliation for the Japanese destruction of its Pacific fleet in the Manchurian harbor of Port Arthur. Under the command of Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, 5 new French-built battleships and 7 slow, barely seaworthy relics spearheaded the Russian fleet. After 8 long months at sea, the exhausted Russian fleet sailed into the Straits of Tsushima, right into the path of the Japanese battle fleet.
So when they finally reached the Straits of Tsushima, you had basically 2 very different fleets. A hardened, battle-trained Japanese fleet that knew exactly what it needed to do to win the battle, and a Russian fleet that was disorganized, full of ships that really were worthless, but that managed to tie down the ships that could have given a good account of themselves to a very slow speed. When you get to the Battle of Tsushima, what you see is the Japanese were able throughout the battle to use their superior speed and superior gunnery to knock out the leading Russian ships, one after the other. If you look at it, it's like dominoes.
Japan's success against the Russian fleet was met with high praise in London. Indeed, Admiral Togo was hailed as the new Nelson for outmaneuvering a fleet of superior numbers. But to Britain's first Sea Lord, Jackie Fisher, the Battle of Tsushima confirmed that the current generation of battleships was far from adequate for modern wars.
The battle was fought at ranges that were relatively long for the time, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 yards. That was long range for that time. The reports he was getting back from his attachés with the Japanese fleet were that 10-inch guns, 8-inch guns, 6-inch guns, these guns, they don't matter. You don't even notice them in a big battle. But what was really important were the 12-inch guns. The 12-inch gun fired on a flatter trajectory, it hit harder, and it was just a better weapon from everybody's perspective than a 6-inch gun.
In early October 1905, Fisher oversaw the construction of the most groundbreaking warship since HMS Warrior. At 15,000 tons and 527 feet in length, she was designed to be the culmination of the latest advances in metallurgy, propulsion, and armaments. Speed was armor, Fisher declared. She would be the first battleship to be fitted with the newly developed turbine engines, giving her an impressive speed of 21 knots. After only 4 months of construction, the massive hull was ready to launch. On a dull, wintry day in February 1906, tens of thousands gathered at Portsmouth's naval dockyards. With a bottle of Australian wine, King Edward christened her HMS Dreadnought. Over the next 8 months, 3,000 men converted the empty hull into a floating fortress. It was only then that Dreadnought's superior firepower became apparent. She would carry 10 12-inch guns, making her 2.5 times more deadly than her predecessors. In Fisher's mind, this all-big-gun battleship would be the supreme embodiment of firepower. With this one remarkable ship, Britain had yet again eclipsed all her rivals. But in doing so, she rendered every battleship on the high seas obsolete overnight, including her own. Almost immediately, Dreadnought sparked a new battleship-led arms race. A dangerous game of one-upmanship that would drive the world towards an unimaginable catastrophe, culminating in the largest naval confrontation the world had seen.